There's a small object I sold years ago for $20 during a spring cleaning that got a little more aggressive than it should have, and it turned out to be worth thousands. I still think about it more than I probably should. I didn't think twice about it at the time. It went into a box with a bunch of other things nobody in the house wanted anymore, and it sold to someone at a yard sale who barely looked at it before handing over the cash and walking off with it tucked in their bag. I still remember exactly what it was, and I'll get there. But that afternoon changed the way I look at things now, quietly enough that I didn't even notice it happening until it already had. And it's exactly why I don't let anything leave this house anymore without turning it over first. And the truth is, I went looking into everything I should have checked back then, so nobody else has to lose something the way I did. Most of it turns out to be sitting in plain sight, in places nobody thinks to look twice. So, before you let anything go out of that old box of silverware sitting untouched in a felt-lined case since a holiday nobody quite remembers, it's worth knowing what actually decides whether it's worth something. Most people assume grandmother's silver is a small fortune, and honestly, most of the time it isn't. The only thing that actually decides it is one word stamped on the back. If it reads sterling or the number 925, you're holding real silver. If it says EPNS or EP, it's only plated, and plated sells for very little no matter how nice it looks under the light. A full sterling service in a pattern like Gorham's Chantilly, one of the most popular sterling patterns ever made in this country, has sold for around $7,500 complete. Broken apart into a drawer of mismatched pieces, that same silver is worth a fraction of that. Completeness is doing almost all the work here, the same way it was doing work on the piece I let go of, though I didn't understand that yet at the time. Fabric holds onto its own kind of proof, just in a completely different language than metal does. Run your fingers along the stitching on an old quilt, and you can actually feel the difference between one made by hand and one made by machine. Tiny, slightly irregular stitches mean a real person sat with that fabric by lamplight for hours, sometimes months, working one small section at a time until the whole thing finally came together. Perfectly even stitching means a sewing machine did the work, and that brings the value down considerably. Quilts made before 1940 draw real collector interest, and the earliest hand-stitched examples, especially anything made before the Civil War, have sold well into the thousands. A quilt folded over the back of a chair looks like it's finished its job, decoration at best, insulation at worst. Sometimes it's actually just getting started. Not everything hides its story quite as gently as fabric does, though. A heavy black skillet crusted over from decades of use looks like the least valuable thing in any kitchen, the kind of thing that gets scrubbed, seasoned, or thrown out without a second look. But a small trademark, used only for a couple of years in the early 1890s by one well-known cast iron maker, a tiny spider stamped into the metal, has turned an ordinary-looking skillet into a $10,000 sale at auction. The mark has to be raised, embossed right up off the surface, not pressed down into it, because that's what tells you it's genuine rather than a later reproduction with crude, shallow lettering. Most cast iron in most kitchens is exactly what it looks like, a good, sturdy, ordinary pan. But rust has a way of hiding exactly the kind of detail that decided what happened to the piece I sold, which had its own small mark I never bothered to look for either. Rust isn't the only thing that convinces people something's finished being useful. Cameras sit in closets for the same reason, looking like something that already served its purpose and stopped mattering. But certain early film cameras, particularly well-made German models from decades before anyone had a phone in their pocket, have sold for several $1,000s in working condition, especially with their original leather case and lens intact. The tell is almost always in the engraving, the serial number, and whether the shutter still fires cleanly after all these years of sitting untouched on a shelf. A dusty camera on a closet shelf looks like clutter. It occasionally turns out to be the nicest piece of engineering in the entire house, built by hand at a level nothing since has really matched. My husband found one of these in his own father's things a few years back and treated it like he'd uncovered a small planet. That same kind of careful, patient engineering shows up in something a lot noisier and a lot less glamorous. Typewriters sit under a layer of dust in a basement or a garage, looking like something that belongs in a landfill rather than a collection. Most of them genuinely are just old machines, worth very little beyond their looks on a shelf. But certain early models, especially ones with unusual color finishes or from makers known for exceptional build quality, have sold for several $100s to serious collectors who actually restore and use them. The condition of the keys and whether the carriage still moves smoothly matters more than most people would guess. A typewriter that still works cleanly after 70 or 80 years is its own kind of proof that it was built by someone who genuinely cared about getting it right the first time. Paper holds onto its own kind of proof, too, if you know how to read it. Old maps and atlases usually turn up folded inside a book or rolled up in a tube nobody's opened in years, tucked away and forgotten the same way a lot of paper things end up. But a genuinely early map, particularly one showing a region before its borders were finalized, or a city before it had the name we know now, can be worth real money to collectors who study exactly that kind of historical detail for a living. Paper condition matters enormously here. Foxing, tears, and fading all bring the price down fast, but a clean, complete example of an unusual regional map has sold for hundreds of dollars, sometimes considerably more, depending on how rare that particular printing actually is, and how many others survived alongside it. Time does something a little different to the things built to measure it. Mantel clocks have become almost invisible in most houses, ticking away on a shelf, or long since stopped and shoved into a closet when nobody wanted to deal with fixing them. A working antique clock, with its original mechanism intact, especially from a well-regarded maker, has sold for several hundred to well over $1,000, and the value climbs considerably if the case wood and the glass face survived without cracks or replacement parts. Most people assume a clock that stopped running is simply broken and worthless. Sometimes it just needs someone who actually understands what they're looking at, the same way my husband assumes anything with a plug and a dial can be fixed by staring at it long enough and willing it back to life. And some things get dismissed for the opposite reason entirely, not because they went quiet, but because they got used until there was nothing pretty left about them. A stained, dog-eared community cookbook, the kind put together by a church group or a local women's club decades ago, looks like something to toss without a thought. But certain early self-published cookbooks, especially ones tied to a specific town or a specific historical moment, have sold to collectors and local historians for real money, sometimes hundreds of dollars for a single worn copy, simply because so few survived being used until they fell apart at the binding. If the spine is cracked and the pages are stained, that's not necessarily a reason to let it go. Sometimes it's proof the book actually mattered to someone enough to use it until it fell apart in their hands, splattered and dog-eared and loved. Here's what ties every one of these together, and it's the same thing I keep coming back to when I think about what I sold. It was never about how new or old something looked, or how fancy it seemed sitting on a shelf collecting dust. It came down to a mark, a stitch, a stamp, a small physical detail that told the real story underneath the ordinary surface everyone else walked right past without a second thought. Learn to look for that detail, and you stop assuming, and you start actually checking, which is the one thing I didn't do that afternoon. with the object that's been sitting in the back of my mind this whole time. It was a small gold-tone pin, shaped like a bow, set with a handful of clear rhinestones that had gone slightly cloudy with age over the years. Nothing about it looked expensive. It had been sitting in a jewelry box for years, mixed in with things nobody could quite place, tangled up with earrings that had lost their pairs, and when the spring cleaning came around, it went into the sell pile without a second thought. What I didn't do, and what I think about constantly now, is turn it over. On the back, small enough that you genuinely have to be looking for it, was a maker's mark, the kind of signature stamp that certain costume jewelry houses used decades ago on their better pieces. Signed pieces from makers like that, especially the more unusual figural designs, have sold for $2,000 to $4,000 in good condition. That's exactly what happened to mine. Sold to a stranger at a folding table who almost certainly knew what they were looking at the moment they picked it up and turned it over themselves. I don't know what happened to that pin after it left my hands, whether it's sitting in someone's private collection now or got passed along again without anyone else checking either. What I do know is that everything I just walked you through came down to the same thing that pin did, a detail small enough to miss and easy enough to check once you actually know to look for it. So before you clear out a drawer, a jewelry box, a kitchen cabinet, or a closet shelf, take the extra 30 seconds, turn it over, read the mark, feel the stitching. It's such a small habit, and it's the one thing that would have saved me from thinking about a $20 pin for years longer than I ever expected to. Tell me down in the comments if you've ever sold or given away something you later found out was worth real money, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one. And half the reason I make these is to make sure fewer people end up with a story like mine. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications, because there's another one of these coming soon, and you're going to want to check your own house again before it does.